You're listening to the David Cassidy Connections with your host, Louise Poynton.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the David Cassidy Connections, your podcast all about David, his music, his friendships, his influence, his legacy. I'm your host, Louise Poynton, and today my guest is Brad Kyle. Brad was the music director at the University of Houston radio station in 1975 when he was invited by RCA to interview David as he promoted his debut album with the company, The Higher They Climb, The Harder They Fall. Brad and I talk about the interview, how he found David at a new and exciting creative period in his life. It is one of the most relaxing interviews David ever gave. You can hear the interview in this podcast, and thank you for downloading this episode. Remember to click on the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts from, so you will be the first to know when new episodes are released. Here is my conversation with Brad Kyle. It's lovely to see you, Brad. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Louise, and it's great to be here.
Know very little about you, and my listeners probably won't know very much, so why don't you treat this like a blind date and tell me who you are and where you come from?
Well, we're going to treat it like a blind date. I better order a drink. Well, I do have my coffee, and it's usually a mix of decaf and light roast, so this is my mixed drink. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. In 1955, I was born. So as we talk about David, I'm 5 years younger than he. So we're going to get to his interview eventually, and I was 20 in 1975. He was 25. I think before we talk about any mega pop superstar, I need to start talking about the Beatles when I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show. As it happened, I was 8 years old in February of 1964 and changed my life. And I know David, he certainly was influenced. I think that's common knowledge now that his main influences, besides the heavy metal he played in garage bands in the late 60s when he played guitar pre-Partridge, he was a fan of the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Because even in my interview, he said he was influenced by Southern California sounds, including, of course, the Beach Boys. And seeing the Beatles is what informed my long-term, lifelong passion for songs, songwriting, classic pop songs, harmonies, melodies, the whole bit. And what was fascinating at 8 years old, first of all, that I cared about music at 8. Having formerly been a teacher and taught that age of kids, I know that they're really not that into music that much, unless whatever their older siblings share with them or whatever. But I was just fascinated by the look, the sound, and that what eventually became a pop culture phenomenon. And that's what I keyed into. So I started buying in the mid-60s all your teen magazines, 16, Flip, Teen Beat, Tiger Beat, even though I was a male of the species, and I know this was an era of mostly girls, and it didn't bother me because fellow boys growing up always, hated groups like the Beatles because they got all the girls and they were good looking and they were famous and popular, so there was a natural jealousy. But I just found it fascinating from a pop cultural standpoint of the massiveness, the hugeness, and I love watching the interplay of, okay, here's an artist doing something, writing songs, singing, recording, and it goes beyond that into, oh my gosh, they're in magazines and newspapers, they're famous. It started to explode for me. Now, the thing that really helped me grow in my love of music was the fact that my dad was in radio. He was selling commercial airtime at the local CBS radio affiliate in Houston. So he would bring home on a weekly basis free records. Now I know you read, and I've dropped a lot of this stuff in my articles on Substack that I know you read. Louise is a subscriber, happily so. But no, I appreciate you being there because I think it helps color in some of why I like what I like musically and again in pop culture. So he would bring home free albums from Capitol Records. So I got all the new Beatle albums as they were coming out, promo albums. And I got to learn more about music free. I was, as a in the late 60s. I was in junior high, and I loved the Monkees. There again, you've got, freshly scrubbed pop music makers with professional songwriters crafting tunes that are catchy, and I love that. And I would read about them in the teen magazines, and it was great. And that's how I grew up, loving music. And I was even a fan of David because, again, he and the Partridge Family and their work on TV in the early 70s fit right into what I was following and really enjoying all the way up to that point in the first place. Beatles, Monkees, British invasion bands, Kinks, Who, all of those, on into the Monkees and then the Partridge Family, and appreciating David and his talent that, as I know we've discussed and I've seen online, I mean, so many people misunderstand David's talent, and we'll get into talking about that. But I was in radio, so I followed my dad's footsteps. So when I graduated high school in '73 in Houston, I went to North Texas State, worked on their radio station for about a year, took a couple of classes. Then I moved back to Houston to attend for a year the University of Houston. Took virtually no classes. I was music director of KUHF, the University of Houston radio station, and had a 3-hour daily shift. And that's like right in 1975. And so that brings us to the point where I first met David. It's very musically influenced. In fact, my dad had 20,000. My brother and I grew up with surrounded by 20,000 LPs and 78s, mostly jazz. So thankfully, I had the curiosity to take my rock albums, put them aside, and occasionally walk into this custom-made cabinetry, wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling with these 20,000. I always say it's a wonder my brother and I didn't catch PVC poisoning, contract it, But I would go in and look, who's this Miles Davis guy? I wonder what he sounds. Let me put that on. Or who's this Count Basie and Duke Ellington? So I grew up with a love of jazz, even though I'm a child of rock and roll and the 60s and all of that rock stuff, starting with the Beatles. But I do have a love and appreciation for Sinatra, Bennett, and all the classic jazz people, Ella, Duke, Count, all those guys as well.
Could you see, or can you look back now and see the influence that music had on the Beatles, the Stones, Presley, and modern day artists?
Well, and that's what's fascinating too, because look at the Beatles. And John and Paul did not know they were world-class songwriters in 1956, 7, 8, whenever they formed the Silver Beatles, and they just wanted to, pull the birds. They wanted to get guitars and play music to pull the birds. So they played covers. And they played covers, and this is what filled most of their first, if not also second album, American R&B standards. As an 8-year-old listening to those early albums, I didn't know from that. All I know is, okay, here's the band called the Beatles. I saw Ed Sullivan. Here they are with an album. I didn't know from songwriting. So, I'm sure I didn't think that. I just went, here's this band I saw on TV. Here they are on their record. They're playing this music. I really like it. But what fascinates me about John and Paul, they can't possibly have known, maybe somebody's documented it in a book somewhere, they can't possibly have known they would be world-class songwriters. It only came about to, we're going to have to come up with some originals here. We're signed here to EMI, Parlophone in the UK. And what do we do now for material? I know, let's write some songs, shall we? And I guess that's as easy as it happened. And, oh, look, we're world-class, once in a century, incredible songwriters. Now, you might have seen my George Harrison article about a week or so ago. Probably from a songwriting standpoint, over the decades, he's emerged as my favorite Beatle. When the Beatles were together, I guess it was Paul. And as I learned more about Paul and his vast influences of music that he had from American Broadway, Great White Way, British music hall music, he had an incredible, a vast array of musical influences that he brought to the table. John, not so much. I think he was more politically oriented, more serious. But I enjoyed Paul's cheekiness, I think, as you would call it. And I could relate to especially what I found out to be his vast knowledge of music that went before. And that's something else I appreciate is anybody's influence, whether they're an artist, a songwriter, whatever they're doing now, if you can find out about what their influences are personally, you'll learn a lot more about their music. I always say that about the Ramones. No one would ever think that the Ramones, who everyone, and yes, I guess rightly said they're punk rock, but they loved the Phil Spector records, the girl group records of the early 60s. They loved the Beach Boys. They loved the Beatles. If you know that, and I didn't even have to be told that when the Ramones first came out, and there's a lot of bands like that, listen to how they're sounding. I bet I can guess they love the Beatles, Beach Boys. I didn't guess the Spector part of it, but when I heard it, I said, yeah, that fits too. And so I mean, it's the influences and all that that's really key.
Do you think your path with your father's involvement in radio was going to lead you down that path of working in music?
Well, here's the thing. Yes, most definitely, because I know I share my dad's love of collecting, because I had amassed myself about 2,000 albums, mostly comps, mostly promos, because what I got from him, and then when I started in radio in the mid-'70s, I got my own promos. But I didn't really have a career, and except for 4 or so years in radio, 2 college, 2 pro stations, one in Houston, one in Baton Rouge, at a couple of FM progressive rock stations, 75 to 77. Then I get into the record business on the retail end. So I was working at record stores in Houston and in LA. I moved to LA from Houston in 1980 and was still working at record stores there. But I was a youth minister in LA for a few years. After I got my bachelor's, went back to school at about 30 in the mid-'80s, and then was a teacher in the 90s and early 2000s. So I did not use all of that. I wish now, in retrospect, I had, because now I love writing about baseball and music, my 2 greatest loves in life, and might have actually even been a decent baseball player, but did not have the self-confidence. I might have been a lead singer. I was lead singer in a rock band in Houston in my high school years for 2 or 3 years, much like David. He was in a high school garage band. I was in a high school garage band. I could have been his lead singer if we'd have known each other and lived in the same city. But I was lead singer in a rock band in Houston. It never occurred to me because at my age and in that day in the early 70s, and I guess coupled with my insecurities, lack of self-confidence, it never occurred to me, as much as I loved being a frontman, a lead singer. Again, in the early 70s, I had long hair. I like Alice Cooper and David Bowie. I tried to mess with mascara and eye makeup just because that was what you did, and made a mess of my face with white goop. It might have been cold cream. It should have been stage makeup, but what did I know? Just trying to fit in. But had I been given anything that came close to encouragement, I might have could have done that and then been like a Lenny Kaye or even a Patti Smith, who are both rock scribes as well as musicians. So I kind of would like to go back and try all that again. And that's why all the time that I was a youth minister and a teacher, I encouraged kids to, whatever your passion is, you might be able to make a career out of this. So whatever it is you do well, and I try to, in the time that I had, like if I'm teaching for 9 months out of the year, I got to know the kids pretty well, and I can pretty much know even at 9 and 10 years old, they might have a talent and a passion in this, that, or the other, and I would make sure to encourage them because I didn't get that. Now, I didn't need that. I'm sure there are a lot of artists who became successful, at least in their craft, if not famous, successful in their craft without others behind them pushing them. But I think they would have had to have a stronger self-confidence than I had in that arena, because now I love writing about music. I love writing about baseball.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention about the lack of self-confidence. So many actors, actresses, musicians, 90% of them admit that they are really quite shy. and they go on stage and they become this whole different person.
Well, and I can certainly relate to that because when I was in my rock band in the early 70s as lead singer, once I hit the stage, I'm going, oh my, I got this. You know, I felt truly in my element. And we had posters made up, and, you know, I was like the front man. I would find dollar things at thrift shops of silver lame shirts, and, you know, I'd play up the part. But there are so many, as you say, you're right, performers in whatever venue, movies, TV, recording, performing, who, off stage, that is their sanctuary. Being on stage and performing is their sanctuary. And that's where they can be themselves and where they feel their comfort level out there in the world. And you're right, we can make a list of all those people that, you know, if you meet them or even in interviews, they will admit that they're just frighteningly, cripplingly shy and retiring and uncomfortable in the world. But put them in front of a mic, in front of a camera, and that's when you see the real them, the true them.
Or put them on a sports field as well. I mean, how many baseball players and American footballers and basketball players do you see them perform? Because in many ways, on the court or on the pitch is exactly the same stage as for an artist. So do you think it's important for us to have idols in music and sport?
Wow, what a huge question. To answer your question, yes. But then there's a comma and a but. Okay. You just have to make sure, and if you have kids yourself or you're teaching kids or around kids, you ought to let them know that they are not the be-all and end-all. Feel free to look up to them. Feel free to be led and empowered by them, but also realize that they are people too. They have their own foibles and their own insecurities, and you've got to follow your path and do whatever it is you do on your own. But it's human nature to have people to look up to. What's interesting about that whole, as Joni Mitchell said, star maker machinery, as big as it can make you, David's first post-Partridge album, the higher they climb, the harder they fall. And he knows. I mean, if anybody knew about the star maker machinery, it made him a star. It also chewed him up and spat him out. And that's I'm, getting a little verklempt right now. I feel so sorry for the life that he had to live. I read his autobiography, I think it was in the 90s, and it was just completely the first time I'd heard about the sadness he felt in the long time yearning he had to be accepted by Dad, Jack. And he never got that because, unfortunately, Jack's insecurity and immaturity did not allow him to love David as David wanted and needed, and to accept David and his talent. All David wanted was for Dad to be proud of him, and he couldn't give that to him. And I feel so sorry since having read that, that he never got that, and bless his heart, to have not been able to feel that because he was yearning for that. Jack didn't give it to him.
Do you think he was constantly amazed? Was he surprised at just how many people loved him?
Well, yeah, but I think in time he realized that was kind of an empty love. I'm sure he appreciated the adulation, and as an artist, as someone who sold merchandise, records, TV shows, whatever he was selling, if you will, in his career, he was happy to be popular and famous in that way. But there again, it's hollow and it's shallow if you're not getting the love and acceptance and pride from the people that you love most dearly and want it the most from, the most badly. You want that really badly. And if you don't get that, I think that leaves a hole in one's heart. And I suppose that leaves you to keep searching for it in whatever ways as you get older, to search for that, whether it's in your craft, your art, or extraneous other things that people have sometimes gotten into trouble with as far as addictions and whatnot,
And I read his autobiography as well, Could It Be Forever? I was left feeling sad. I just thought, that's so sad.
I think he was dying for a hug. I think he just could have used a hug to, to help that kind of warmth and intimacy that he didn't get from Daddy. And I hope that all of the fans' love for him, he felt that hug through the airwaves, through, the fans' love. I hope he did.
I mean, you will find the Elvis film compelling from that point of view. It was an amazing, apart from Austin Butler doing the most incredible representation of Elvis, which you would think would be impossible, he actually nailed it on so many levels.
Well, and there's an interview, because I don't really know much about Austin Butler and his past to lead up to this role, but Goodnight Nurse, what a task to undertake. And my brother was an actor and even wrote a play, and so I know the struggles that it took to have him not only write it, but put it on its legs and put it on stage. And that was back in the 80s. But I mean, and that was an enormous undertaking to become another character. And like I say, without knowing much about Austin Butler's past, I got to see what led up to that magnificent performance that I'm hearing he gave.
David certainly had that visual impact. Do you think, and again, I'd like to talk about your very interesting conversation with him, do you think he was underappreciated and that people really couldn't look beyond the idolatry and see more than just a pretty face?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was pigeonholed, most definitely, and a bit hamstrung and handcuffed, and whatever analogies you could use, word pictures. And that's what ultimately the sad part of his career was. The good news, though, is he didn't just chuck it all. He kept writing and recording, and the people who can understand that and go and find it and listen to it will be amazed. David, for the TV show, he was singing songs that professional songwriters, amazingly talented tunesmiths were hired to create those songs. So yes, he was singing and performing, but by the same time, it probably wasn't music that he loved, because he goes from being in a garage band in the late 60s, playing guitar, loving Hendrix and Zeppelin and all that hard stuff, to this stuff. But is that the kind of music you really want to be singing to use your talents for, guitar and voice? Likely not, but it's your job, you do it. We all have jobs that we have to kind of show up and punch in, and we do our jobs. And that's why that first RCA album in 75 is so noteworthy. And what I found amazing, even at the time, I don't think I questioned him on this, but again, I was 20, but I was amazed. Okay, David, here's your first post-Partridge album right out the gate. You can do anything you want to do. And why it didn't sound like Black Sabbath or the Rolling Stones or something kind of took me by surprise, but frankly, I'm glad it didn't. Because, and here's, to answer your question, I'll answer your question this way. Here's who knew David's talent. Everyone in the industry. He could have called anybody, and they would have said yes, not but because, the famous David Cassidy just called me. That ain't it. It's the fact that they knew he had chops. They knew he had a voice. They knew he could play guitar. They knew he could write. But Bruce Johnston and a couple other Beach Boys and Beach Boy adjacent, Jerry Beckley from America, they were happy to help him out. And I know they would all agree that they come out sounding great thanks to David and the accompaniment and just playing with that great musician. So to answer your question, the general public, absolutely not. Wikipedia and everybody, the internet slots David, bubblegum, it's pop, teen fandom, and that's all they know. And you really have to dig to find the really good stuff from David himself, not somebody else's material that he's kind of churning out for the TV and record industry machine.
Take me to the events that led up to you meeting him in the midsummer of 1975.
Well, I can't remember being asked directly by an RCA rep. I think the station manager at the University of Houston radio station, where I was music director, comes to me one day and says, the RCA guy, the local regional RCA rep, says David Cassidy is coming to a downtown Houston penthouse as our music director. You want to go and interview him? I said, yeah, sure. I'm sure I was the only one at the station. I was the most appropriate one to go as the music director. But I find it hard to believe anybody else really would have been interested and done the job that I think it needed to be done. And I say that because of the half a dozen or so media types in the room, I was the only one who didn't ask about the Partridge Family. I knew why he was there, to tub thump the new RCA album of his own stuff, of the music he wanted to now present. So I went. I just wish I had a camera. I took a reel-to-reel tape recorder from back in the day in 75, probably a TIAC. I think it probably had a cover and a handle and carrying it to there. And David had no problem with me setting it on top of the coffee table in front of myself. And then he was to my left in a chair. I was on a couch next to some other writer or media type. And I asked him, do you mind if I record? Now, I had nothing that I was going to do with the interview. In fact, the microphone was 2 or 3 feet away from him. It was nowhere near him until the end of the tape, at the end of the interview, when I wanted him to do a station ID. And he did 2 or 3 of them. Hi, this is David Cassidy, and you're listening to, I think my name at the time was Brad Davis online. I changed my name several times, I guess to stay ahead of the law. But... and so he did them very graciously, and I would put them back at the station. I transferred them to, we had 4-track cartridges. They were the size of 8-track cartridges, but they were 4-track carts, as we call them abbreviatedly. And I would put these IDs on cart and play them like once an hour, probably leading into one of the softer songs on the RCA album, because the afternoon shift I had on the U of H radio station was a kind of a soft rock, not easy listening, but any of the ballads or soft rock things on his album would have fit right in. That's how it happened. And what I find really incredible is the discovery. Well, let me just lead up to, so during the interview, one of the highlights of about a 35-minute interview for me was somebody else asking about a single off the album. And one of the singles, if not the first single off David's Higher They Climb album, was Get It Up for Love, a song written by LA songwriter Ned Doheny, who about a year or 2 later, Southern California guy, I'm sure David knew him, recorded an album for Columbia. But it was only about a year or 2 after David and a couple other people recorded Get It Up for Love. Now, David started to say in the interview that, that is the single off the album, Get It Up for Love. And then David says, there was somebody else on RCA a few months ago, a guy with 3 names, I can't remember who it was, who recorded it. Well, I had his album, That Guy with 3 Names. In fact, I had the single, so I knew who it was. Now, at the moment, I'm feeling like I'm on Jeopardy because I've got to now buzz in with the answer pretty quick, or the conversation turns to something else. But the domino of events that happened, because I remembered the name of the guy with 3 names, I go, Stephen Michael Schwartz? And David goes, that's it. So in the article that I wrote, it says, me and David Cassidy working together. All right. So Stephen Michael Schwartz was 20 years old in 1974 when he recorded his first album for RCA Records. Now, in the article of my interview with David, I list, there are so many things that David and Stephen shared in common. Young, good-looking singer, songwriter, guitar player, RCA Records, recorded Get It Up for Love, the same song. So after I wrote the article about my interview with David, and I wrote that article, and I think published it on Substack in February of this year. So after I wrote it, I decided to do a web search for Stephen Michael Schwartz, because after that RCA album in 74, his first at age 20, I had no idea what happened to Stephen Michael Schwartz. Sure enough, he's got his own website, StephenMichaelSchwartz.com, and it turns out for 2, 3, 4 decades, Stephen was a kingpin and a major player in the children's music lane. in a trio called the Parachute Express, and then solo. So I look on his website, and he's got a contact